Highlighted for you here is the pancreas and your gland. Looks really nice. Let's focus on that pancreas. Actually, you'll notice, how many have taken human anatomy? Good idea to take that before taking this class. How many found it helpful to have taken human anatomy? Some places make it a requirement that you take anatomy before you take physiology. We can't do that because there's too many. It's too hard to get classes as it is. You can't put any more research. But you can still do it. I never actually took an anatomy class. Doesn't mean it's not important. But I was a biochemistry major as an undergrad, so I ended up more anatomy of a protein. And I've had that like memorized. But anyway, if you see human anatomy, you have some context that's the size of the liver, and it's not a small organ. So you can see right away that the pancreas is not a small organ. Whereas the hypothalamus and pituitary gland were small. The pituitary gland was the size of a pea. Hugely important, though. You know you don't need a huge gland to produce a lot of hormones. But here you have one, and that's because a lot of this is also exocrine, which you need for digesting food. So we'll get into that, the exocrine functions, when we get into the GI system. But for now, in your usual ducts, you take an epithelial tissue, where I modify it to secrete either hormones or exocrine. If you really look at the cellular anatomy of the pancreas, this is a nice cartoon, really highlights it. You see cells, and in the middle you see an island. Someone named Langerhans. Notice that's what they call it, the islands of Langerhans. You can see if you've got, on the outside are all these exocrine glands. And that's what we'll talk about when we get into the GI tract. But you also have in the islands, you have your alpha cells. Your alpha cells, not as many of them, the blue ones. And those produce glucagon. Beta cells, which I'm probably sure you've heard of at some point. Beta cells are the green ones, the more abundant ones, those produce insulin. There's also delta cells, which we're not going to talk about very much, produce somatostatin, which we'll talk about when we get to the GI. So for GI function, not only do you need exocrine, you also need hormones to regulate the GI tract. One of the hormones comes from pancreas. Again, I'll focus on insulin. Insulin, remember the absorptive state we talked about. Insulin helps control the absorptive state. This is kind of misleading, and you'll see why. Glucagon is considered a hormone of the post-absorptive state. One problem you have with glucagon is also a hormone of the absorptive state. You'll see. Anatomy of the pancreas kind of helps. It does nothing new. This is what it would actually look like if you did work in the lab. And here, the one thing that maybe makes it clear, the islands are a little more. Insulin is a peptide hormone secreted from the beta cell. What you're going to promote with insulin, definitely promote with insulin, is anabolic reaction. This means you're going to produce those larger molecules. You have insulin in the time of absorption. This is when you have plenty of nutrition around. You're going to take that energy and convert it into storage molecules. Key thing it does, it promotes glucose uptake by the body. Glucose isn't helping you in the blood. It's in the blood. Blood is just to transport things. All your blood is doing is carrying things from one part of the body to the other. It's supplying everything, for example, oxygen. Rid of the carbon dioxide, but glucose in the blood isn't helping you. So in order for glucose to have an effect, you have to get it into